All right, let's get started. Welcome to this NAR Initiative session on short-term rental trends in the Mountain West and how to craft an ordinance to handle them. My name is Jake Powell. I work for Utah State University Extension, and I am the lead of the NAR Initiative core team right now. So for anyone who may be new to the NAR Initiative, NAR, G-N-A-R, stands for Gateway and Natural Amenity Region. And the mission of the NAR Initiative is to really help gateway community and natural amenity regions and the communities in them thrive. And we do that through enhancing what makes them special. So we do that through catalyzing and supporting research, education, and doing technical assistance. And we're especially thankful for Utah State University Extension and the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism at USU for helping to support the NAR Initiative. If you want to learn a little bit more about us, our website it will be posted in the chat. We would love to have you check out more of what we do. If you haven't already done so, if you want to know more about us and get really targeted information, we'd love to have you join our community. And you can sign up for our email list. That way, you'll be the very first to know about what's going on with the NAR Initiative, upcoming webinars, resources, tools that are being developed. So with that, let's get started and focus on the webinar. This is our second in a series of how to shred gnarly challenges, and we're focusing on tools, techniques, and resources to help address epic housing challenges. So if you want to know more about this webinar series, the link to the home site will be in the chat as well. And we will be, our hope in really doing this series is to provide some applicable how-tos and actionable approaches that help us all make progress on addressing housing concerns in our own communities. So with that, we want to thank some of our sponsors and partners who make this possible: the Wallace Stegner Center at the University of Utah and Granicus for their financial support, as well as a special thanks to the American Planning Association of Utah chapter, which provides AICP continuing education credits for this, as well as some of our other webinar series. So if you are interested in AICP credits, we'll have the link to this specific event in the chat. As well, we're always looking for more sponsors and partners to help us do our work. So if you're interested, you can shoot us a note. As well, you can donate through a PayPal account if you really want to provide some funding sooner rather than later for the work that we do. So with that, I want to talk just really quickly about what to expect in today's session. First of all, along with all of our other sessions, they're all recorded so that they can be available on our website. If any of you have been part of our website, we try not to create traditional webinars. We want to make webinars that are interactive and interesting. So it will be interactive in a couple different ways. First of all, we will be using the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your Zoom window. And that's the way that we want you to submit any questions you have for our speakers. Additionally, we'll be using the chat function, and that's really a way for you to share your thoughts and experiences. So we'll be asking you a few really targeted questions about your community. We know that you're the expert of what's happening when it comes to housing and short-term rentals in your communities, and we want to hear from you. So when we ask you a chat question, there'll be a word, it'll say prompt, and then we want you to type in your response, but don't share it until we ask. And the idea is we want you to not be influenced by other people's opinions and be able to freely think about and share your own opinion. So as well, when we do this as academics, we are always looking for trends and opportunities to understand what's happening. So we do use the information from our efforts and our webinars as research data. So your participation is informed consent. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to let us know offline. So as I said, we're going to start by engaging you with a chat question. So let's give it a try, get a little bit of practice. So to help everybody online get to know who is joining us and who's in our audience, we want you to introduce yourself via chat. So first thing you want to do is make sure your chat is set up, and most importantly, make sure that it's set to go to panelists and attendees. So I'm going to give you a quick prompt. I want you to type your response as well. As I said before, try not to hit and submit it until I ask you to. It's really easy to want to hit that submit button, but we don't want you to be distracted. So the first prompt is, please let us know your name, the community you represent, or live in, and why you signed up for this webinar today. Okay, so I'll give you about 30 seconds to type those in. All right, if you've typed those in, go ahead and share those with us. We've got people from Idaho, it looks like, some folks from Blaine County, good to have you here. All the way from Alaska, near Zion National Park, you can see this, we call it the chat waterfall coming in. Really great opportunity to see people from, it looks like, all across the West and beyond, which is wonderful. It seems like there are probably housing issues occurring all over the United States. And by the look of who's here, there's a lot of interested people. So what I would like you to do last of all, as we transition, is to change your name if you can. If you can change your name to your name and where you're from, that would help us know who's
Jake,
from where.
they can't change their names on the webinar. Only on meetings. Sorry, guys.
Thank you, Liz. So also, I can't proceed without thanking Liz. Liz Soja is our NAR coordinator who does all of the extra effort to make these a possibility. So thank you for her keeping us all on track and especially helping me. So the rest of the event is really focused around 4 really incredible experts that joined us and were willing to share their expertise on short-term rentals and housing and how to manage them. I'll allow each of them to introduce themselves and talk about their designated topic. Just a reminder, again, if you have questions for any of the presenters, please post them through the Q&A feature. That'll keep the chat and the Q&A separate and clean. And as we throw those questions to you in chat, please use that to respond to the prompts. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jordan Katcher to help us frame the rest of our discussion. And thanks again for joining us today and sharing your insights and wisdom and learning from these 4 experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jordan Katcher, and I work for the state of Utah's Community Development Office. We wanted to start out this webinar a little bit by just sort of providing an overview of, at least from a Utah perspective, of some of the unique challenges that we've been observing over the last couple of years. For a little bit of context into the organization that I work for, I'm within the Housing and Community Development Division. And our team in the Community Development Office, we have the privilege of supporting and working with Utah's rural communities. Utah is blessed with 5 beautiful national parks, over 60% public lands, et cetera. There's a lot of access to these kind of communities. And so when we talk about NAR, Gateway and Natural Amenity Region, we have a lot of those types of communities in our state. When I started with our office a little over 2.5 years ago, I was a part of an initiative called the Zion Regional Collaborative. This is down near Zion National Park, which includes a number of really incredible small towns that are surrounding that park. And we got together on a quarterly basis to talk about very unique challenges related to gateway communities. And one of those was short-term rentals. At the time, I didn't actually know what I was getting into. I had offered to do some preliminary research to figure out what are other communities across the state doing? How do we enforce in our state? How do we look at all the different dynamics at play, both for the host, but also for the visitors and also the long-term residents as well. And what actually ended up happening is I looked for experts, right? So I looked around and I found a couple of really great individuals, some of which are on this call right now. I was able to be connected with John, who is a former Garden City mayor, Brumby, who is with the University of Charleston, and then now just recently with Christa and the Granicus team. But each of these individuals essentially has a plethora of expertise around short-term rentals. I was able to interview them, get insights into, what have they been experiencing on the ground, especially because they've been able to observe communities all across the country and beyond. And so what we ended up doing is with their feedback, we were able to put together a guide on short-term rentals specifically for Utah. But I'm going to share that in the chat. That way you all have access to it. It is a little out of date now that we've just had our last legislative session for our state, but we do hope that it may be useful for you. This is also included on the NAR website insights toolkit as well. But essentially, we kind of just wanted to preface with the fact that these are really incredible individuals that gave their time to us when we needed some expertise. And we're so excited to hear more of what they have to share with us today. So thank you, everyone, for being here, being part of these discussions, because short-term rentals it's an emotional issue. It's a very emotional issue. Housing in general is. And so really excited to look into tips and tricks for designing ordinances and looking at unique challenges and trying to figure out how do you navigate all these different interests in one community, and how do we look at the complexity and try to simplify things as best as we can. So with that being said, I'd love to ask a question for you all. So in the chat, where we're going to put the prompt for, in sort of less than 10 words, how is your community managing short-term rentals? And please be as honest as possible. We love honesty in these settings. So if you all can take a look at that and give yourself a moment to sort of think about how have you all been managing short-term rentals so far? So we've got not addressing them yet. So super, super new, not very well, need to, but aren't currently. We can't, legislatively controlled, right? So looking at state dynamics at play, looking at local dynamics at play, license systems aren't addressing, patchwork of management, like the Wild West for sure. Using taxes, struggling, being sold, HOA restrictions. Some cities in northern Idaho have ordinances, many small communities do not, right? So thinking about the size of our communities, the capacity, and just being able to learn from each other and design those kind of ordinances, absolutely. Restricting them in certain areas, right? So there's different ways to manage short-term rentals, beginning the draft stages of putting together an ordinance. Well, that's perfect, Megan, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, is how to essentially put together an ordinance. And so let's get to it. I'd love to segue over and have our presentation start. So again, thank you so much for being with us. And we're really excited we will have a Q&A later on after the presentation. So please put in any questions that you have, and we'd love to answer those at the very end. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jordan. And thank you for having us in general. We love talking about short-term rentals and, the challenges governments are facing and how to solve them. So thank you so much for putting this together. It's really a treat to join you today. My name is Christa Watson. As Jordan mentioned, I'm with Granicus. I'm the senior marketing manager there. And essentially what I do is I help inform communities about what other communities are doing that are best practice for short-term rentals, help them understand what resources are available out there to solve short-term rental trends, and everything in between. So I did actually see a few of our customers popping up there, and I'm so glad to have you here. And I'm sure I've chatted with you before. And yeah, just like to get this started. So just a little bit about Granicus as a whole. Granicus connects governments with the people they serve by providing the first and only civic engagement platform for the public sector. Nearly 4,500 federal, state, and local government agencies work with Granicus for communications, digital services, and other processes needed for resident engagement. Granicus host compliance within Granicus is a trusted solution for local and state governments looking to solve their short-term vacation rental compliance challenges. We provide software, data, and guidance that empowers local authorities to see short-term rentals as the opportunity they really are. We have worked with hundreds of communities on short-term rental programs, from major metropolises like LA to smaller communities like Grand County. We have seen a wide variety of challenges related to the short-term rental industry and government relations and solved them. I want to invite John and Brumby to introduce themselves rather than myself spewing about them, about their accomplishments. Brumby, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for having us today. My name is Brumby Mcleod, and you're probably wondering, what does Charleston have to do with the Intermountain West? I studied second homes for my PhD between 2003 and 2005, went to school in UNLV and also school at University of Montana, and then spent a research sabbatical out in Utah and worked closely with John Spuhler and the tech company as we conducted a project in the mountain region related to ski towns and how basically vacation homes or second homes are being utilized, and really discovered this convergence of around housing, particularly in these gateway communities. So thank you for having me.
Fantastic. And John?
I'm trying to get my video up, but I don't know that I can. It's saying I can't. So you'll have to look at my Bear Lake picture there. My name is John Spuhler. I was the mayor of Garden City, Utah from 2010 to 2018. And during that time, we saw the economy go from, really bad to really good. But part of our area that really spurred on the economy was short-term rentals. But some of the challenges we weren't expecting, workforce housing, issues like that, we started to really need to get data to make good policy decisions. And we really didn't have that data. That's where I ran into Brumby, and we developed from my past life some technology that is now part of the Granicus offering to make sure that communities had good data, so the hyperbole didn't necessarily rule the policy. It was more data-based decisions. And so I'm excited to be with you today and share some of the things I've learned in speaking with literally hundreds of communities, large and small, across the country.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. In terms of our agenda today, we're going to start off with a short-term rental market overview, just more so level setting as to what's going on at a very macro level with short-term rentals. And then Brumby will go into short-term rental tourism within the Intermountain West specifically. And then we'll get into what everyone here is for, the ordinances best practice, as well as effective short-term rental enforcement, because those two really come in together. And of course, we'll have lots of time for questions. So please ask your questions throughout, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So to start off, really level setting here, what is a short-term rental when we're talking about a short-term rental? Now, this can change by jurisdiction, but generally when we're talking about short-term rentals, we're saying that it's the use of a residential dwelling unit for rentals for less than a month. Generally, when it's over a month, and like I said, every jurisdiction will be different. I would love to hear if you have anything that's over a month or under a month for short-term rentals. But generally it's less than a month, and it's commonly booked through services such as Airbnb, Vrbo, Flipkey, etc. And in terms of the short-term rental market, it is exploding. It's really grown from a cottage industry to a multi-billion-dollar market. Across the US, there are more than 1.8 million short-term rental listings, representing 1.4 million unique rental units. To clarify, a listing is an advertisement for a short-term rental. And so when we say a unit, it's reference to an individual property. For example, if I owned a short-term rental property in Durango, I may own one unit, but advertise or list that unit on Airbnb, Flipkey, and Vrbo to maximize the occupancy of that limit, meaning I could contribute 3 listings for my one unit. And in 2020, we saw a huge jump in revenue share from, and in general, we are seeing more communities that are impacted by short-term rentals. Sort of like that 100 short-term rental listings is really a good indicator of sort of the tipping point between something that's a bit of a nuisance and something that can actually become a problem. And we know for our communities that is quite common to see over 100 short-term rental listings. And as you can see in this graph, there's been about 2.3 times growth of the amount of communities that are seeing more than 100 short-term rental listings within the last few years. And so that is a huge amount of growth. And in 2020, we saw that there was a huge jump in revenue share for short-term rentals within the total lodging market. So in terms of total lodging, how much did short-term rentals actually take up in terms of revenue? Really, that in 2020, that was 25%. So if your city, county, township depends on lodging revenue from bed, transient occupancy, or lodging taxes to fund programs, and you don't have a way to reliably collect these taxes from this market, or only a small percentage of short-term rentals are actually compliant with these tax regulations, you could be really missing out on a large portion of revenue that could be theoretically used for really important programs. And many analysts agree that short-term rentals have proved even more resilient than traditional lodging during these hard times. And Airbnb, which is only one short-term rental website out of more than 100, now has a valuation higher than some of the largest hotel chains in the world combined. So they're here to stay, basically. And really, and really more than ever, short-term rentals can be an opportunity for government because you're looking at short-term rentals as the lodging that is seeing the most activity rather than the ones that are hurt the most, especially in large tourism industries or towns such as when you're comparing like restaurants or others, really looking at short-term rentals as a way to source revenue by increasing your compliance, creating an even playing field. It's a really fantastic opportunity for governments. But unfortunately, by not addressing short-term rentals effectively, it's not just a lost opportunity. There are some real risks to communities when there's no oversight, even though short-term rentals generally aren't bad actors on their own. These range from a conversion of long-term rentals into SCRs to nuisances like garbage being left out for days on end, a lack of community cohesion, and unfair competition. We'll be covering some really helpful strategies local governments can make to address both the problems and the opportunity in this session. Another aspect that makes this issue more complicated, on top of all these other, on top of the growth and on top of the opportunities, is that even with a fantastic ordinance strategy, very few short-term rental hosts are proactively compliant with local and state regulations. Meaning without proper enforcement, many short-term rentals aren't going to register to get the proper permitting, licensing, remit taxes, or go through any sort of life safety requirements, such as making sure that they aren't fitting 6 beds into 1 bedroom, etc. If you're unsure about how many short-term rentals are operating in community illegally today, get in touch with us as we have all that market data at the ready. And now that we're all on the same page when it comes to short-term rentals, it's time to dig into the Intermountain West. So I'll pass over to Brumby.
Thank you, Christa. My move into the Intermountain West really came when I spent my sabbatical in Park City, Utah with the chamber, and then worked with a number of municipalities to look at really the status of where the nightly rental business was. And we started that research. In 2016, I started working with John Spuhler, looking for a technology that would help us in the coastal region of South Carolina. We had beach communities that the entire accommodation inventory was made up of vacation rentals. And so I wanted to study what that looked like in the mountain regions, and Park City became my home for 9 months. But we can move to the next slide if you would. So I really like this research by Jake and his team. I think NAR is a great acronym. I used to call them lifestyle communities, but basically they're highly desirable places to live and that are amenity rich by default. They tend to have large pools of second homes. At the time that I was writing my dissertation in mid-2000s, people couldn't connect the dots between a second home and tourism, but there was evidence from the National Association of Realtors and others that when or if a market presented itself to make their renting easy, it would be a pretty significant pool of inventory. Migration patterns to NAR communities have only accelerated in the pandemic, but we saw that before. It just was rapid. They tend to be the gateway to many rich regions, and they've often been engaged. Usually tourism's the primary economic driver already. Now, to compound the housing demand, you typically have development restrictions and land conservation at play. And then the consumer demand for residential short-term rentals has changed. We've seen a much faster recovery in the vacation rental business than we have in the hotel business. And so that's also driving this. And then those who had these homes often are rethinking whether they want to be in the long-term rental pool because the short-term rentals have a higher return. And then lastly, we're seeing this high cost of construction. And these just a list of many of the driving factors. But let's take a look at the next piece. Just to give you there was a question, I think, from Harry about Harry Griffin about the kind of number of listings. Now, it'd be neat to put these over the number of housing units. But when we look across the counties of Idaho, you'll see these are, well above the 1,000 mark in number of listings in these top 3 counties. You look at Summit County in Colorado, and that's just a staggering number. And you see that in a number of these Western counties. You can go on to the next slide as well. And you'll see these sit right at kind of the gateways to these parks, national parks, state parks, lake regions. They often are overlapping on mountain ranges like Gallatin and Madison. And so this has become pretty instrumental in how a city and county addresses their housing needs. So what we set out to do was to create a tool and technique that we could start to look at this more granular. And so I'm going to share with you one of these matrix we designed that we started using the term housing matrix, housing utilization, or housing mix. And what we are really getting at, we're trying to get at, is what is your housing doing? And I think the piece that makes this most challenging is that it's dynamic, it's seasonal, and then you have these regional factors. So when we went to do this, we were trying to develop an understanding of a particular housing mix in a community. So we're taking a snapshot, much like a balance sheet in a business. And and we would ask this question: where do your overnight guests sleep? Where does your workforce sleep? Was becoming a question that became more and more important. And then how are your second homes being utilized? Because one of the things we were seeing is within a community, there were districts and neighborhoods and areas that were not as prone to nightly rentals as others. So just want to give you a framework of what we were trying to look at. So if you'd advance to the next slide, I'm going to show you a snapshot. Now, we did this off census data and Esri projections, and this was around 2018. And the reason we wanted this information is that first column was giving us an idea of what the total housing inventory was in a community. And what we were hearing from the community leaders and municipal leaders was the shortage of housing. And what we were discovering, with probably the exception of Durango, which had some really unique circumstances to it, is a lot of the housing was perhaps not being utilized except for the homeowner. So if you look at the first column, we looked at total housing units. The second thing we looked at, what were owner-occupied units. So we considered these residences. And then the second was renter-occupied units. So those were long-term rentals. And then the fourth element here was this vacant housing units. And we calculated a percentage of vacant housing units to kind of show what was in limbo. Now, what we did for this webinar was we went in and used Granicus data to identify the number of unique nightly rentals that appear to be operating within that region. And what you'll see is that those numbers are substantial. Now, keep in mind that those are 2 different date formats. But I'd like to pause right now. And Liz, I'd like you to put the prompt up about how the inventory of short-term rentals has changed in your particular community. And so if you would, what can you tell us about the inventory of short-term rentals in your community in the last 5 years? And please include your community name. Yeah, I see dozens and hundreds. Many of you don't have these numbers yet. And what we were identifying here was really a starting point that you could start to look at, because ultimately what you have are ordinance levers that you can start to shift how housing is utilized. And that was really the goal here. It looks like all of these cities are well over 100 to 500. I see Sun Valley come up. You know, one of the things that I found fascinating, particularly in the Blaine County region, is if you were going to do this housing mix in your community, I highly recommend you take a regional approach. So you might look within Blaine County and then identify the cities in that Wood River Valley to develop what that housing mix looks like in that corridor. And one of the reasons that's important is ultimately every nightly rental that's used as a nightly rental is displacing a housing unit that could be used for a resident or a long-term rental. And so a lot of times a city that puts in maybe a draconian ordinance to end or keep out nightly rentals will be shifting that demand to another one. So if you could go ahead and advance to the next slide, Christa. So where we're going to move to now is really the levers of the ordinance, because these are the tools. And I think some of you mentioned it in the early questions. I'll ask this before we go, Liz. Let's go one last prompt. I'd like to know how the attitude has changed. And I don't know if you guys noticed that Lake Tahoe was one of the cities on that list, but there was a pretty substantial shift in that community around nightly rentals. And we've seen a lot of cities go back and modify their ordinances. So this last question, how has the attitude towards short-term rentals changed in your community? That's good. I see Jackson Hole, go home, right, is a common refrain. Yeah, these are putting significant stress on the housing stock. Panic for locals, right, displacing. Yeah, these aren't easy issues. And so as we go into the ordinances, the ordinance guidance that John Spuhler is going to share with you, I want you to think about the type of ordinances you have or are considering. I like to categorize these, and one of the categories I like are kind of livability nuisance ordinances that are around trash, parking, and noise. I'm a big fan of strategic ordinances. I've seen ordinances that really zone certain areas to allow it. I've seen caps and such. I like experimental ordinances. I felt like Tahoe was a good example of that, and then you come back and fix it. And then, of course, the draconian ordinances. For those that have maybe a real negative view of second homes, you know, I've had to always kind of balance my research around the pros and cons. But one of the things that has resonated with me is the amount of homes that sit empty in our communities. And so when you think about this, I think a lot about housing utilization, you know, by just banning it. many of these will sit empty. And if you go one step further, they're already existing inventory that can be utilized. So how could you encourage rentals in maybe certain types of units that maybe aren't playing in that round? And with that, I'd like to turn that over to John Spuhler.
Fantastic. So I'm excited to be with you. We experienced a lot of the challenges. We went from about 50 short-term rentals to about 500 short-term rentals. And within that process, we had to continually change the ordinance, right? There isn't something static where you could just say, this is good for now. Sorry about that. The change in the ordinance is really important, and you need to be able to keep up with what's happening. So if we can go on to the first slide, that would be great. I've worked with hundreds of communities, including one, and my good friend from Santa Fe County, looks like they're on the call here today. And so one of the things I would like to discuss is this cycle that we run into. So I put this together, we call it the virtuous versus vicious cycles. And you see this happening a lot of times in communities, especially if you really don't have your arms around this and they start to grow really rapidly. So the vicious cycle is that cycle that happens when all of a sudden there's this kind of, I wouldn't like to necessarily, it's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to somebody that's saying, look, these things are really bad. We're having a hard time with short-term rentals. And that may be true, but then the reaction, from council or from staff is, how do we regulate? And how hard can we regulate? So what they end up doing is they create maybe some regulation that makes all of a sudden they went from almost no regulation to, this incredible amount of regulation. And so then you get pushback, right, from these operators, and then they become illegal short-term rentals. And then the community gets negative. And then there's this cycle that says, hey, look, everything that's happening is the result of these short-term rentals. And it goes round and round and round. Versus what I would like to call more of the virtuous cycle is to say, how can we work with this business community that's here and start looking at maybe our general plan, our master plan, and look at what we want in a community and actually develop a positive approach to what does this mean and how can we, really regulate this in terms of a reasonable regulation, which invites people to come in, but at the same time, what we're able to do is create more of this virtuous positive cycle that creates revenue and economic opportunity. So I know that let's give an example of in your community, if you've reevaluated, and we're going to just do a little prompt question here, or modified previous ordinance. Is there anybody that had an ordinance and said that didn't work for us, it started to work for us, but it changed? I think that's the question we need to post there. If you would prompt that up for our audience, if you would. Okay, so it doesn't look like we have a lot in that particular area that you've modified. Maybe you're just getting into your ordinance. Again, I would suggest a starting point is going to your general plan and looking at what the community, and maybe you don't have a general plan. A lot of small communities don't. So one of the things you should do is start to look at what is your community all about, obviously, and the general plan is usually a good place to start before engaging everybody else in this process. I actually like to start it from the staff who has to deal with this, and that really seems to help out a lot. Next slide, please.
John, we actually have a poll that'd be great to run to better understand where the audience is coming from in terms of their current state of regulations. Liz,
Okay.
do you mind?
So we're going to do this poll here. If you want to fill this out, that would be great.
Yeah, so the first one is, how are you informing your approach to short-term rentals? So we talk to a lot of agencies who come to us, and they are just inundated with complaints, and then that's getting them to act. Some of them they get some information on what is happening in the short-term rental market, and that's pushing them to that's pushing them to move forward with either regulations or enforcement strategies or whichever. So how is your agency getting information on how to approach short-term rentals? I mean, you're in a great place. You're here with us today. So, so that's a great step to take. And then the second poll is more so related to what we're talking about now. What stage is your community in when it comes to short-term rental regulations and compliance? So do you have regulations and, but however, there's low or you don't really know how compliant your short-term rental market is. Do you have regulations and you're doing really well with compliance? Most of the short-term rental hosts are compliant with your local and state regulations. Are you currently moving towards regulations, which I know a lot of you in the chat were saying that you are moving towards regulations, or are you still unregulated and there's no current plans? Liz, how are we doing in terms of people filling it out?
We have about 50% of the audience who's filled it out.
I think probably share the results then. Okay, so it looks like most don't have an approach yet, but you know what, you are here. So you're getting a lot of the information that you need. So great steps there, as well as gathering data on rental activity. And as I mentioned before, if you need more of a deep dive on what is happening in your short-term rental market in your specific community, we can definitely help you with that, as well as resident complaints, which is totally normal. Complaints aren't easy to avoid, and they're still a great source of what's happening in your community. And then what stages in community and when it comes to short-term rental regulations. Given that this is a talk about ordinances, it does make sense that most of the audience has unregulated or doesn't have ordinances in regards to short-term rentals, but a lot of them are moving towards regulations. John and Brumby, do you have any comments on the polls?
Well, it looks like folks were utilizing data and make decisions, which is good. That's what we should do. A lot of times related to short-term rentals, I think that was 22%, the highest. A lot of times the short-term rentals, the squeaky wheel gets the grease from the community, and we start to make policies based on the loudest voices. But it looks like this group, at least 22% of them, are focusing on data to make those decisions, which I think is very helpful. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Success is built on a solid foundation. So the first thing to consider is creating an ordinance that is relevant and enforceable. I mean, I've had, unfortunately, the opportunity to see so many of these short-term rental ordinances, many of them, that really are so complicated and just about unenforceable. They don't really have a staff to enforce them. They don't have a lot of tools to enforce them, yet they've created a very complex ordinance. So sometimes simple is best. And there are really important processes that you can do to start out. Registration is one of those. An empowered and accountable enforcement team. So you've got to be able to empower them with information so that they can effectively enforce that ordinance. We see a lot of times ordinances that are built around, well, you can have 14 days 3 times a year, or you can have your short-term rentals, definition is very different than the standard. And, we're going to have to track how many times a year they're able to do it. And there's just a lot of different challenges when you can't enforce your ordinance, and it's not worth doing, right? There's no value to an enforceable ordinance. And then efficiencies in systems, it's important to utilize technology that will help you solve your problems. And so that, you're not trying to deal with 67 different platforms that, listings are coming and going based upon events like a few years ago, a solar eclipse, for example. You need to be able to log into something and make some, have an efficient process. Okay, next, please. Okay, so what we know for sure, right, is every community is a little different. There isn't a size that fits all. And it's super important that, Santa Fe County and the nuances of the road system and all of the stuff that goes on in one of the oldest really one of the oldest places in the United States, is very different with their roads versus, you know, maybe a grid system in downtown Salt Lake or Orem or someplace like that. How's parking, you know, dealt with, and you know, people parking on the side of the road. So the point is really simple. You have a unique community. Make sure that you customize your ordinance to fit your community. Workforce housing in smaller communities, because you have very few housing units, is really an issue. You really want to start thinking about that early. What does this mean in terms of housing? But again, one size doesn't fit all. So essentially, understanding the goals of this program, you know, what are the goals? Outlining the goals, understanding what the neighbors' concerns are, explaining to your neighbors that we do have data and an enforcement mechanism makes a big difference, because people bought a home in a certain area and all of a sudden they feel like, gosh, my neighborhood, my experience in my community, I don't have a livable community next door to me anymore because I have a hotel next to me. And so you need to explain that, hey, we've got an ordinance and we're going to enforce it. Integrating STRs into existing community vision. So that general plan, that master plan, the thing you guys have worked so hard on, and if it's super out of date, go back into it and start doing those meetings, because those are important things to look at. What is the vision of the community? You know, maybe your community is not as tourist centric, and that's not the vision. Maybe it's more urban. So whatever that is, incorporate that. So again, the tools are really important. We use tools in everything we do. So we're gonna, you know, tools are super important to make sure that you can manage these effectively. And engaging success. What is success? Like, what is the standard of success in your community? Is it TRT money? I can tell you that was a big deal. We needed revenue, and we went from 50,000 in TRT dollars to 500,000 in TRT dollars. But as we went through, you know, really in a short order, that's a lot of money. So we were able to build a park. We were able to take some of that money to, you know, put in a fishing pond and some neat things there. But as it continued to grow, we also recognized workforce housing was a problem. So we had to shift gears and start looking at these issues. Okay, next slide, please. So we just talked about housing availability. If you have a relatively small number, and Brumby, if you want to riff in on any of these, please feel free. Housing availability can be an issue. And if you have a very large number of short-term rentals, and you have like we do, a large number of short-term rentals, we're having a challenge right now in Garden City because we just don't have places that people can live. That's cost, you know, it's just cost prohibitive for someone to work in the service sector and live in Garden City. And so now we're having to look at tweaking that ordinance and making sure that we have housing availability. And there's various ways to do that. How do you zone effectively for neighborhood preservation? Maybe there's certain areas that I know in Charleston, for example, or different areas, there's historic districts. Like they want that neighborhood preserved for specific purposes. What does that mean? And how do you do that? And so we can help you there. Quality of life. I mean, everybody wants, you know, quality of life. How do we make sure that those guests that are coming into the community and the hosts are effectively communicating, hey, look, you know, you're in a golf course community, but that doesn't mean your 4-year-old should be driving the golf cart, right? So these are some of the things. And how do we communicate that effectively and make sure that the hosts are on board, that this is all one team working together? Economic development too. Like, what does that mean in terms of the economy? We want jobs. We want people to stay in our communities. So how do we balance all those things? And then life safety. You know, these are real. Life safety, I learned something. We learn from communities all the time. I had a Montgomery County, Maryland said, you know, a big county right next to Washington, D.C., they said, look, what we're going to do, we don't have enough code compliance officers to register all of these short-term rentals and do a life safety inspection. So what we're going to do in our registration process is simply have I, John Spuhler, certify that I have a smoke detector. I, John Spuhler, certify, self-certify. And so then they sign off digitally saying, I will do these things. And it really shifted the liability to the host and really, you know, really dealt more with a free market approach to it. And that was a community in Maryland. And now we see that as kind of a best practice around the country happening more and more.
John, if I could add 2 comments on this slide.
Sure.
One of the things we saw in the Charleston community was the option for neighborhoods to put together their desire to be engaged in the nightly rental allow it in their particular neighborhood. And that became an economic development driver. That neighborhood's seen a lot of positive change, but now they're looking for other levers to slow down that growth. And so, you know, we're seeing that kind of strategic ordinance take shape.
Thanks, Brumby. Yeah, next slide, please. So here's some specifics about you know, things to be sure you're clear on. Terms and language used to address STRs. Don't be vague. Make sure you identify and define each one of the things you're trying to accomplish clearly. Registration is really foundational, because during the registration, you can also do some education. So when someone's going to register, and if you have your registration fees that are really, really high, especially if you're just starting, you know what happens? People push back and say, geez, it's, you know, I know one little community was $1,500 to register your short-term rental. Compliance would have probably been more difficult for those people. And frankly, they can put a listing on so fast and take it down so fast. Sometimes it'd be better just to say, look, let's take a reasonable approach to registration. And that's up to each community, right? I'm not telling you how to create policy, that's up to you. Zoning implications are super important. Like, where do you want these things? Do you want them across the entire city, or would you rather have them in a certain area? How does zoning and HOA, CCNRs and all those rules, you want to kind of engage with those concepts. And especially, again, look at your master plan and your zoning maps and look at them and say, hey, this makes sense here, but it probably doesn't make sense here. So those are some of the key things to consider. Single and multifamily property considerations too. So, you know, do we want them just in the multifamily area, or do we want them in single family housing? Requirements for inspections. Again, I think that a really good best practice is, especially for communities that, you know, I think would be effective is in this webinar, is if you don't have a large staff, you know, require that there's self-certification on an annual basis, that I self-certify. And, you know, we have tools that can make that really easy for them to go online and self-certify and add information in about that self-certification. But that's just a suggestion. If you don't have any penalties, it's not going to be very effective. So unfortunately, that's the world we live in. I had a Utah State Senator, good friend of his, was out of compliance, was renting illegal in our town. He called me and he said, you've given him a $7,500 fine because it's $750 a day. And fortunately, we had tools where I could put together an evidence package, but guess what? He got into compliance really fast. So if you don't have any tools, any compliance penalties, it's probably going to be difficult. And so then evidence collection, like I said, people can remove their listings really quickly, but with our product, we have historical data and we can show that, you know, John, you may have removed your listing, but, you know, let's be honest here. Here's what we see. We know, let's just get in compliance. Let's register. Let's be part of this, and so forth and so on. Now, if they're out of a zone and they're trying to list in zones that aren't allowed, you see that a lot, and you'll need this evidence so that you actually have an opportunity. And in the case of Charleston County, where Brumby is, our products were used very effectively to mitigate lawsuits and liability issues related to this. All righty, next question. Or next slide, sorry. So ambiguity. So oftentimes we'll see in an ordinance that there's ambiguity. You know, let me give you a really, I think a good example is communities will collect taxes on short-term rentals, but yet say they're banned, right? What message does that say? And there's a lot of communities that do that. They say, hey, we want our TRT or TOT or lodging taxes, whatever you want to call it, but at the same time they're banned. So, you know, anyways, if you guys have some questions, I can answer those now. Let's go ahead and answer your questions. If you've got some, I think Christa said there's some questions coming in. Do you want me to answer those now, Christa?
It was more so a comment because I do really like the questions coming in. Maybe is it legal to set a hard cap on the number of short-term rentals in a town? Maybe we can start with that one as a little bit of a break, and then we can answer some more at the closer to the end.
Yeah, so it depends on, you know, whatever your statute is in your state and count, and maybe there's some county rules, but we do see caps. So for example, I'm thinking of a community in Oregon where they said, gosh, we want to cap it at 17%. It was actually 17% of their total housing inventory. It was a coastal community. 17% of their total housing inventory, they capped short-term rentals, so that when someone actually left the short-term rental pool and a new person came in, then they would be up to that cap. So they capped it based on a percentage of overall housing. They didn't want to have more than 17% in that community. Now, yours might be more or less, but yes, I see caps that are out there, and typically they're legal, but you'll want to check with your county or city attorney on that. Any other questions before, Christa, before we move on?
There are, but maybe let's go through the presentation a little bit more, because I know a couple of them we'll answer through the presentation.
Okay, yeah, so you can see some of the ambiguity issues. You know, is it okay if we swap? You know, short-term rentals aren't allowed, but I didn't actually do it, so we're just swapping. Is that permitted or not permitted? I'm assuming, you know, everybody has a different take on it, but I think that you need to be clear on what it is in your community. Anyways, let's go on to the next slide.
John, I wanted to comment, you know, one of the things we see, particularly with a community starting to try to regulate, is that pendulum swing, where they try to go too far, right?
Right.
Where early on, we're simply trying to identify, maybe license or register, but then you start getting into how many people can be in the home and kind of over-regulating. Just want to mention that.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the key issues you want to talk about is occupancy, because occupancy, you know, you can break down occupancy based upon the number of actual bedrooms, because you have parcel data, right? Assessor's data that says there's a 3-bedroom, 4-bath house. And when you start comparing, someone saying, I want to put 30 people in there, occupancy becomes an issue. But as Brumby said, you don't want to over-regulate it, but at the same time, occupancy, the more occupants you put in there, essentially it creates more impacts. So, you know, I think that what hosts try to do in a very competitive market is they try to overinflate their occupancy. They say, yeah, come to my little condo and you can bring 20 people or 12 people. That's a problem. And if you address it early and you have some occupancy limitations, I actually think it's a really good thing to look at, you know, the size, the square footage, the amount of parking, and then you can actually build that into your ordinance to say, look, you know, we want smaller, less occupancy. It's safer for the people that are going, and it's fair across the board. So it creates equity across the board for all the hosts. So it's not as big a contentious issue. Otherwise, you have these people that will say, oh, I want 60, I want 80 or 90. It's insane, really. Some of the sizes. And that's the thing to do. So penalties we see here again. I really do think you need to have penalties. Make it easy to participate, but if you're not willing to participate and our barrier to entries are low, you know, we expect you to participate or else type thing. Let's go ahead with the again, the unreasonably high burdens of proof. Typically these are really not very helpful. And when you get into a legal situation, when you have a very complex ordinance that requires really high burdens of proof, specifically around calendar bookings and occupancy, like you can only book, you know, 4 times in a quarter. I mean, you see these things like you can book 4 times in a quarter or whatever. Those things create, yeah, prove that I'm booking 4 times in a quarter, and absolute proof of that booking. How do I know it wasn't just, I just booked it out for my mom, right? Or for me personally, right? Because my booking shows it was booked, but it doesn't show why it was booked. So, you know, just be careful in how you put together your ordinance so that it's clear and it doesn't create this really high bar for the city to have to jump over to actually go to court and win. Because we find a lot of times the city doesn't have the evidence, they go to court and lose. Okay, next slide, please. And if you guys could let me know, Chris, if I'm on time or not on time, I just want to make sure we are.
We're a little bit behind.
Okay, so let me try to speed it up a little bit. And then, just let me know when we want to take some of these Q&A questions, because the most important thing is their questions more than all of this stuff. Then we can kind of go off that. So stakeholder involvement. Sometimes it's better to not involve all the community. Everybody wants to do an advisory board, and then they've got the vicious cycle and the other people, and they never get along and they never create it. Sometimes it's better to create this internally, honestly. So I think that's a really good approach internally, meaning office staff, elected officials, planning and zoning, and then put it out for a public hearing versus having these, ongoing, just all the time, these agendas that, and these advisory boards, they go on forever and they just fight because they're on the polar opposite ends of what they think is right. And there's no give and take. Yeah, so I think that there is a question here, and Brumby, I can answer it. Someone asked the question about how do, if you want to put that up again, Christa, how do cities scale or find the funding to scale, I think was the question. Is that what I saw come up?
Yes, the question was, how are cities finding the resources to scale for enforcement on short-term rentals?
Okay, this is a great question. And so one of the things that we do in cities and counties and communities is we have impact fees for things like water, sewer, different type, even roads and parks, right? Those fees are to offset the cost of the additional development or the new home or whatever. But in this case, we can't really create impact fees, but what we can create is a fee structure on the registration and licensing so that you can actually have enough revenue. So I would suggest that you don't want to make it too high, but you don't want to make it too low, because if you do, then you're offshore. You're basically letting everybody else in the community pay for the additional cost of these businesses to be in business. So a reasonable approach would be to say, look, if it costs an extra $20,000 a year to manage this, and I have 200 short-term rentals, then an additional $100 in my registration fees would cover that. So those are the types of things that I would look at to scale, is where are the impacts, what are the costs of that, and who should be paying for it. Okay, we can move on to the next slide.
John and Christa, just to let you know, I'm trying to answer a number of questions in the Q&A too as we're going along with typed answers.
Excellent. Thanks, Brumby. So preserving community character is so important. And I feel like we've really missed the boat here recently in Garden City. If you've come to Bear Lake, anytime some of you people from Utah, we have so many people coming. And I think we're missing out on the character of what we're doing. And it's because we didn't adjust over the last few years. Like, okay, the growth was great. It helped our economy. But now we need to really consider, workforce housing, communities. What does agriculture mean in our community? Does it mean anything? And going back to the plan, the general plan, and sometimes it gets away from us. So preserving community character is something you should really consider. And then also, obviously, revenue recovery. There typically is a good return on investment. If you're in a county, or a city, and there's a transient room tax or occupancy tax, those lodging taxes, and even the sales taxes to your businesses and real estate growth, usually there's a significant revenue recovery. And we have a tool to help you identify how much will be available in revenue recovery. Like I said, in our community, it was so significant and important. A new library, a park, building baseball fields right now, things like that. And all really out of TRT tax dollars, transient room tax dollars for short-term rentals. Okay. All righty. So do we want to go into any of the Q&A? Oh, we'll get the questions and answer next. So anyways, we want to talk a little bit about how to automate this process so it's not this massive heavy lift. We have a assistant clerk that was handling this in our city. She's a great gal, but really her background is not computer technology. And I had her with a 3-ring binder trying to research VRBO, Airbnb, and making sure everybody was on board. And boy, it was just a nightmare. And so having effective rental enforcement tools is super important. And let's talk about those really quickly. So as you know, there's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of websites The big ones you're aware of, platforms like Airbnb, VRBO, HomeAway, Tripping, Booking, etc. But there's some really unique ones, like in our gateway communities. Like there's one called The Dirt, right? They're just going to rent you. You're going to rent out a piece of dirt on property that you own, and you're going to put, or Hip Camp, or some of these. So there's a lot of different things happening, and they're renting in different ways. So the sharing economy is spread across lots of different websites, and we analyze those. So next slide, please. So manually tracking these, this is what I was, our assistant clerk, Shar, I was like, how do you manually track all these? And keep in mind, they come and go so fast, because based on the season, it's winter season, it's summer season, there's an event. And I think I saw someone from Richfield, Utah. They have all the basketball tournaments and lots of things going on out there where, it's kind of the center of Utah pretty much. And so you have all these events coming and going, and people pull their listings on and off all the time. And how do you track all that? Well, we have a tool to do that. Next slide, please. So here's a couple ways to get folks on board. And that is, you can actually get the word out that we're going to do this through the local press. You may have a local newspaper, People Talk, you might have a local Facebook as well. So, and then publish the rules and registration steps on your website. Make sure that they're clear. And electronically, if they're web enabled, a lot of people work from their cell phones. They hardly even use a computer anymore, especially these younger people. So, make sure that it's web enabled too, right? It's totally, the Internet of Things, I think they call it now. So clearly explain why the registration requirements exist, so people realize that complying is in their best interest. We're not here to crush your business. We're here to actually sustain your business long-term, to help you have a sustainable business, which means you have to be part of the community in this. I would say conducting a registration workshop, or having just a computer set aside at your building. Maybe you have a town council office or city council office, or just your office, and you set up a computer there that people can log in and register. A lot of times they like to come to the city office, and so they can register, and your clerk can say, here's what you got to do next, things like that. You can include information about taxes. All those types of things are really important. Again, I hit number 7 before I hit number 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to this really quickly, because I want to make sure I can get this in. This is a web portal, a cloud-based system, where it doesn't matter if you're on your iPad or you're in the office, you can pull up your jurisdiction. So we draw the shapefile around your jurisdiction, so it'll map out your city. We can create zones within this, so that it's not all just one blob, there's multiple zones. And then you can get a complete inventory of how many short-term rentals, how many new short-term rentals, and all these are like interactive links. And you can actually drill down to the parcel level with each one to say, hey, there's a dot there. Let me see if that short-term rental is registered. And you'll notice at the top right that it'll say compliant or not compliant. And that's based upon your ordinance. So we programmatically build that right in so that you understand, hey, are they compliant or not compliant? So you get high compliance with this. Next slide, please. And when we do that, that was like a 50,000 foot view. Then we can actually bring it down to like a 15,000 foot view, where we're saying, here's the pictures of each listing, here's the address. It is compliant because they have a license with us. Here's their occupancy. I can see it in there. So we're able to pull all kinds, I think there's over 100 different data points on average that we pull out of each listing. And we know the person, we actually connect the dots. So John Spuhler is actually listing on 1832 South, 250 East, etc. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, someone asked a question. These are functionality software elements from the Granicus platform, exactly. Send property owners a letter to make them aware their property has been identified. So we're able to provide, and you can provide screenshots to say, look, we know your listing. Here's the listing. Here's what this looks like. Here's a way to get in compliance. So there's an example of the listing. It's high resolution listing with screenshot with instructions on how to be part of the team here. So number one may be a nice letter. Letter number 2 may be an ugly letter. Okay, go ahead. So once someone gets caught, what's nice is we can actually create an evidence package that shows them you know, hey, here's what you've done. We've got this. And typically they never go to court. This really saves you a lot of legal costs and things like that, because we have a package we can build for you so that we show, look, you've been, you know, you're not compliant. And if they continue to be persistent, then essentially we have this package that we can move from and go to court and win. Go ahead. Yeah, so there's some great questions coming in. John Bristol, have communities done economic and fiscal impact analysis of STRs? Yes, lots of communities do analysis and what the total is. One in particular comes to mind is San Diego. They figured that an average short-term rental in San Diego brings an additional $18,000 to the community per year in different types of additional economic development opportunities, and that's in San Diego. So that's a big urban environment, may not fit your environment, but there are lots of studies in all environments. So anyways, make sure that the punishment fits the crime. I mean, I hate to say this, but there's a big city in one of the biggest in the United States that I work with, and they have a $5,000 fine. And by the way, Levi, absolutely true. And I'm glad you brought that up. In Utah, by the way, you are not allowed by state law. Representative John Kavanaugh wrote about 4.5 years ago some legislation I think is good legislation, I honestly do, that says you can't just prosecute for someone, you can't prosecute a short-term rental for being illegal based upon the listing. But you can use that listing data to go and do research and then to find them. So you can't do it solely, I think the solely is in there, solely on the listing data itself. So if you're in Utah, you have to bring a little more to the table than just that. And typically people comply once they know you have the information. So you can reach out to them, you can speak to them, you just can't cite them based solely on a listing. So great question, Levi, thank you for that. Make fines as fair as possible. West Hollywood fine structure allows visitors to set their own fines. I don't think that's a good idea. Anyways, next. Okay, so eliminating quality of life issues, make it easier to intervene. Require hosts to notify their guests. So here's this really important issue, guys, is that you have the really good host that's doing his best or her best, and all of a sudden you have this really turkey guest that comes in, and in spite of their best efforts, sometimes in spite of their best efforts, the guests can really create a problem. So what you can do is just make sure that you have your ordinance reflect that you're required to provide information to your guests. Maybe it's a book that goes inside of the home. Maybe it's something on the outside home, but make sure that the guest understands they also are responsible, right? You're in a neighborhood now that you've never been in before. Don't have your kids at 2 a.m. jumping on the trampoline, right? It's not appropriate. So these are things that you can build. You can build some things into the host ordinance that says you must educate your guests. You're ultimately responsible. We need guests to be educated. 24/7 contact information is very helpful. I actually thought it was very important that contact was local. There's a really good one from Mike. So outdoor fires, like really super important in Utah, right? And also obviously Colorado and most places in the Rocky Mountain West. I would really encourage that you wrote something in there in your ordinance, and that, hey, you need to let people know, your guests know when there's a fire restriction or what's allowed and what's not allowed, because people will go out. I was talking to Sun River, Oregon recently, and people were lighting fires. I mean, it's just dense forest, and just going out there and start little fires for their little camp, making some marshmallows and having a good time. But it's like, no, that's dangerous, right? So anyways, make it easy for neighbors to report issues. If you don't have a hotline, it's worth getting one. It's one of the services we offer as a hotline, so neighbors can easily report without actually you can make it anonymous or not anonymous, and we can record that call and provide digital images, so we can show if we have to talk to that host that, look, your guest actually did light a fire in the wilderness. Someone took a picture of that. So anyways, next, please. Let's see, make it easy for hosts. Yeah, this is really important. the tax question is really, really difficult. So what you have, and the reason it's difficult is because Airbnb, frankly, has made it really challenging, because in some markets, Airbnb collects your taxes. In some markets, they don't collect taxes. In some markets, they only collect it at the state level. Some markets, they collect at the state and county level. Some markets, they don't collect it at the city level, the small city level. So there's all of these different things. So that's Airbnb. VRBO and Expedia does the same thing, but Booking.com out of the Netherlands doesn't collect any of the taxes. So the owner says, hey, guess what? We already paid our taxes. And he's like, well, the Booking doesn't collect your taxes. And really? Oh, I didn't know. And sometimes it's true. So you really have to be able to create a very simple way for a host to pay their taxes. And I think it's really important that you recognize that not all the platforms collect taxes on behalf of the communities. And we have tools to help you collect and report those taxes really easily. Next, please. So here's some best practices for holding serial offenders accountable. The hard part about this vicious cycle and this virtuous cycle is usually the vicious cycle, you've got a few bad actors and they're not about the community. It's all about making a buck. And I'm not opposed to making a buck, right? But I am opposed when making a buck comes, in front of every other basic premise of civility. And so go straight to a citation. No need to, if you see somebody that's continually offending, go in there and issue a citation. A lot of communities are afraid to do that. But I would say definitely the word gets out, especially in small communities, that holy smoke, Rockville is issuing citations now for parking. If you've ever been to Zion's and that parking down there gets nuts, so issue a citation. So anyways, these are some of the things I think that you need to have, obviously a good ordinance, strong, clear worded ordinance, but don't be afraid to go ahead and issue a citation. Like I said, $7,500 to the senator's best buddy. And he called up and he said, whoa, I guess you got him. I said, yes, we do. Because he told the senator I'm not violating the rules. But I said, yes, you are. I was pretty happy about that, by the way. Have offenders sign an affidavit that states they are aware of the rules. So that's a good thing to do in the best practices in your registration, is have them sign an affidavit. Yes, I, John Spuhler, am fully aware of the rules and will comply. Most people will sign that. Okay, and if they're not, they don't get a license and they can't participate. Short-term rental is a business. I mean, they're filing taxes, paying taxes, et cetera. It's a business. Okay, next. So I really want to get into the Q&A as quickly as we can. These are the tools that I just went through with you. We identify the addresses, we can send them letters, we can provide permitting and registration, we can collect taxes, we can provide a hotline, and we can even monitor the individual unit to see if they're paying taxes correctly. All of those are put in this product package, and these are modules. You don't have to, if you were a Granicus customer, you wouldn't have to buy all these products. You could just say, I just want to know who's doing what, and build around that data point. That's address identification. But you may just say, look, I just really want to get the permitting done and then do the address identification. Those are two different modules. And so price scales based upon what types of tools you're buying. Next, please. Oh, yay, I got to, I think, our favorite part. Oh, no, this isn't my favorite part. Granicus is a huge company. I'm really glad they bought we had about 85 cities that were using the product that I built called STR Helper. And cities like Charleston and, small cities like Garden City and Moab was one of our first customers. Grand County was one of our first customers. Great, took a shot on us. And the Granicus has a whole bunch of tools, but they've got a big financial, they're financially very large. So, it's a large corporation. They've been in business since 1999. So they have the wherewithal to do what's necessary and to keep evolving as the technology changes and it shifts, because it always is. Okay, next, please.
And so, so John, I'll take over on the grant funding.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you are interested in taking on more enforcement, or if you're interested in outsourcing some of your ordinance writing to a team of experts, or any sort of civic engagement product or project that your town may have, whether that is building a new website to help educate tourists coming on, or transforming your permitting and licensing process to make sure that your hotels and your restaurants can get their permits faster. There is very likely grant funding right now for that. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, you can get in contact with us. We have a Granicus grant support program that's specifically meant to help your community get funding for initiatives like that. And the American Rescue Plan funding has $360 billion for state and local governments for projects like that. So highly encourage you to read up more on the American Rescue Plan funding. Of course, if you are American, as I know I did see some Canadian attendees as well. So just wanted to flag that. As I mentioned early on in the session, we do have a lot of information on the short-term rental market, and we talked a lot of very high-level information. We had a few specific cities and counties that we highlighted, but if you're interested in learning more about your specific short-term rental market, get in touch with us today. It's completely free. We'll cover how many short-term rental units you have, how many short-term rental listings you have, a general map. I know someone asked a question about zoning requirements in terms of whether you allow short-term rentals in certain zones. So if you get a map and you have a specific zones where short-term rentals aren't allowed, and there's a bunch of short-term rentals there, we can help you strategize on what to do there. So get in touch with us today via the Granicus website. Or you can just email us at info@granicus.com, and you can get your complimentary assessment, and we can talk about what are the next steps you can take for your short-term rental program specifically for you. So I'm going to pass it over to Jordan, who has started curating a bunch of questions. I know that Brumby has been very active in the Q&A. I think we will answer a few of the questions for the audience as a whole, so I know they're really interesting. Jordan, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, Christa. Yeah, thank you, John and Brumby and Christa. So we, for those of you in attendance, we do have a Q&A tab at the bottom. So I just wanted to mention that if you haven't been able to open that up yet, you can click on that and you can see the answered questions already. So there have been some great questions that have already been asked. Thank you. And Brumby's been tackling those. So for our panelists, I just want to just kind of give you all just an opportunity to also expand on the questions that you already answered, but then also I wanted to open it up for these unanswered questions. So let's start out with, how do you navigate property owners' argument of property rights? So meaning when they're purchasing the property, there weren't any regulations in place, and now there are. How can a city or municipality legally defend the takings clauses?
Yeah, so you hear that discussion a lot, and it's actually, I think, a pretty legitimate discussion. The problem is, and I had this discussion with, I can't tell you how many cities, but the problem is that we've kind of let the genie out of the bottle over years and years and years. It was never addressed, like it wasn't addressed. So in certain zones, you know, you obviously go, gosh, this isn't a commercial zone. Why is it we have a commercial business? And yet you've got, you know, 50 or 60 of them in a subdivision with 120 homes. So now that genie is going to be real hard to put back. So the political will of the community has to be such that they're willing to fight that fight. And I find that most of the time they're not, because it's a really big fight, right? So I agree that so there's two sides of that. One is in the community. I bought into a specific community because I didn't want to have a hotel next to me, right? That's one argument. The other argument is my property, I can do what I want. I think that's actually a pretty poor argument, and here's why. Because we have zones for a reason, right? You bought a house in a single family area so that you don't have maybe right next to you a hog farm, right? You didn't buy that, you know, you've got all kinds of reasons that you buy into a zone and expectations that come with that. So as long as that's not being violated, I don't think your private property rights are being violated. But I do think it's a violation in some cases. And by the way, you know, I own short-term rentals, but what I try to do is make sure that I'm aware of the community around me and making sure that I'm making sure I'm a good citizen for those folks. And so anyways, I hope that answers your question. It's not like a straightforward, just like black or white question.
Thank you, John. I know that we're running a little bit late on time, but let's ask, so this one's interesting. So if Hilton buys up a residential neighborhood and lists them as Hilton's home rentals, as short-term rentals, how is that different from running a hotel? And what's the difference if John Smith does it instead of Hilton?
Yeah, so I think that what I heard you say is that, hey, what's the difference between a hotel and a short-term rental? In fact, I think the hotel industry was late to the game on this because it's not very fair in some cases, whereas a short-term rental has more advantages, more benefits, right? Even than a bed and breakfast. So, you have a lot of old ordinances have bed and breakfast rules that say ADA compliance, hotels have ADA compliance, you have sprinkler compliance, you have all kinds of compliance measures. And in this particular case, it seems to be that the STRs have been able to get a pass on that. And so, frankly, the difference is that an STR is growing and exploding around the country because they're not having to have the additional costs that traditional hotels would have. And that's very profitable for them.
Jordan, we are seeing that too. Marriott has a home rental agreement, and they're actually utilizing existing property managers that are kind of, market leaders. So they're certainly moving into that space, and probably going to utilize a lot of their reward programs in that regard.
Awesome, thank you. And it looks like we have time for maybe one more question. So how about, are you aware of communities incentivizing switching from short-term rentals to long-term rentals?
I'm so glad someone asked this question because the answer is yes. There are communities, and I've heard of small and large. So one of them that I know is in Aspen, and I have someone from Steamboat right here that answered. But in Aspen, they have a deed restricted housing, so essentially it's for long-term, set aside for long-term housing, not short-term housing. But then there's other communities that will say, if you want to do a short-term rental, we're going to charge a higher than normal fee, but we're going to take some of that money and we're going to put it aside for purchasing property for workforce housing. So so what they were able to do is say, look, this is impacting workforce housing. We're in a small community, very touristy, very focused on a very small season. We need, and guess what? It worked out really well. So they've been able to buy property to say, hey, look, we got to accommodate that. And then they can bring in developers and say, look, we've got the land, you develop on it. You need the business community needs the workforce. Let's put them here for this workforce housing. So that's one of the ways I've watched it happen.
I love that example. Thanks for sharing that, John. So I want to be mindful of our time, so I'm going to hand it over to Jake with the NAR initiative, but thank you all panelists and attendees for being a part of this webinar.
Great, thank you, Jordan, and thank you for helping to bring this group together to talk about this really important issue. Just a couple things to follow up. Any questions that we didn't answer, we'll try to address them in the summary that goes out. We also record this webinar and it'll be posted on our website if you wanted to refer to some more information. Just a reminder, our next webinar is coming up. If you didn't notice, John and Brumby and Jordan are extremely passionate about the work that they're up to and extremely knowledgeable. So in our next webinar coming up, it'll be focusing on educating guests. So the title is Educated Guests Make Good Neighbors, how to educate short-term rental guests. And I think that's part of that pyramid that John and Brumby shared with us about how do you actually manage this stuff. So thank you so much. We're looking forward to seeing you on May 20th. If you haven't registered, go to nar.usu.edu. You can click on our main banner there and it'll take you to the registration page. So thank you again to our panelists today, for Jordan and Liz putting things together, and for all that you do out in the communities to make things work where the rubber meets the road. And our effort is to continue to support you. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to the NAR Initiative team and we'd love to help you. So with that, we'll sign off. Thank you very much.